Good evening, everyone.
Ben bugün sizlerin mektubunuza kelip söz gelgim için hoşalman. Sizlerin bizdek bir izleyen milletlerin dert ahvalını anlaşıp kirgeligler için sizlerge rahmet ediyorum.
And it's really my great honor to come to AU to speak to you about the plight of the Uyghur people. And also I'm very glad that you are very interested in our situation.
Yukarıda Guantanamo'nun meselesini derketti. Alt verilmiş Guantanamo'nun bağlarını bizden izleyen milletin ki buna siz yetvatkan avazını dünya anlatamadan bir millet için teşkillermiş, Aksaray'ın altıdamış, katlık soğukta turup, şu namayışını uyuşturup tuğan ballarına ve şu teşkilatını uyuşturup benim görevime gitme.
And first of all, before I begin my speech, I would like to express my deepest appreciation to the Witness Against Torture for their campaign to release the 17 Uyghurs at Guantanamo, and I saw them protesting in front of the White House in such cold weather, and that has meant so much for me and for our people.
Ben turmudun çıkka vaxtımda, yaki turmudun içi vatqa vaxtımda, menimki xalqımın avazını dünyaya paqat anlatamadım. Tibet xalqının avazını dünya anladı. Çünkü dalaylaması boğalığı üçün. Menin xalqımın dünya avazını anlasa, iki adam Sibiryaga chaqirsa, bir Arab için balkaş o'tkazib Sibiryaga uchib berib shuni so'zlab xalqimning dardini aytman deb chiqqan edim.
And when I was imprisoned by the Chinese authorities, I always had the hope that one day if I were released from that dark cell, I'd rather want to go to like places like even Siberia. Now, even if two drunks are interested in our plight, I would go and tell them about the suffering of my people. So I'm really honored here today.
Lekin ben g'arb dunyosiga chiqqandan keyin sizlardek yuzlab, minglab, o'nlab odam mening xalqimning ovozini anglayotdi, meni bugun nechani anglab o'tiribsizlar. Guantanamodagi ba'zanlar terrorist deyotdi, ba'zanlar emas deyotdi, ba'zanlar bunas deyotdi. Xalqning ichida Guantanamoni Uyg'ur desa, Uyg'ur degan nima degan bir hammadan savol qo'yotdi. Men shuni bugun o'zimizni shishib bermizlar.
And since my release and coming to the United States, I have had the opportunity to speak before hundreds and thousands of freedom-loving Americans who are so concerned about the situation of our people. So I'm very grateful. And today, our focus is more or less on Guantanamo. So I would like to explain to you whether those Uyghurs were terrorists or how they ended up there.
Hazır aldı bilen bir ailem tanıştırıp bitip gitey. Benim ailem aldı bilen yoldaşım 9 yıl bastırıqda yetip turmadan çıktı. Ben özüm 6 yıl yetip çıktım. İki balam hazır, bir balam 9 yıl kesildi, bir balam 7 yıl, iki balam günahsız turmadı.
And giving you a little bit background of my family, political background. My husband was imprisoned by the Chinese for like 9 years. And I was imprisoned for nearly 6 years. Now my two sons, one is sentenced to 9 years, another is to 7 years in prison. They are still in Chinese prisons.
Üç balam 11 nevret nazaret astılar.
My 3 other adult children and 9 grandchildren are under surveillance, under house arrest.
Yoldaşım yazıcı hem okutuşu.
And my husband is a writer and a former professor.
Ben özüm Cumhuriyet'te 7. derecelik çoğun bayttım.
And in the 90s, I was actually one of the 7th wealthiest entrepreneur in China.
Ben bugün üzerinden xalqımın avazını yetkizmem, hazır pulum yok, kem olan.
But now, I'm speaking, on behalf of my people. I have become their voice. But now, of course, I'm not as wealthy as before.
Benim xalqım, milletimizin ismi Uyghur, vatanimizin ismi Şarkı Türkistan.
And of course, the ethnic name of my people is Uyghur, and we call our homeland East Turkestan.
Menimki vatanim Orta Asya'ga tava Cumhuriyet'in altıdan bir kısmını egallaydi.
And my homeland is in Central Asia. It is 1/6 of today's Chinese territory.
Tilimiz Kazak dili, Kırgız dili, Özbek dili, Kazakistan, Kırgızistan dilleriyle ortak okşaş dil.
Our language is very close to the Kazakh, Kyrgyz, and Uzbek languages.
Ular bizden kardeşimiz oldu.
They are our ethnic brethren.
Tarihte olan Garbi Türkistan, bizden Şarkı Türkistan deb atanan.
Historically, they belong to the Western Turkestan. We belong to the Eastern Turkestan.
Ularni Rossiya besib oldi, ular mustaqil bo'ldi, bizni Xitoy besib olgan, biz mustaqil bo'ldik.
They were occupied by the Russians. Now, after the collapse of Soviet Union, all of them became independent states. But we were occupied by China. We are still under Chinese rule.
Biz 20 milyon halk.
And Uyghurs are up to 20 million people.
Bizning özümüzden tilimiz, özümüz icad kılgan yezikimiz, özümüz yaratkan tarihimiz, özümüz kurgan devletlerimiz, öz alaylıkımızki medeniyetimiz bir etnik hiç kandak Xitay bilen münasebetimiz yok bir millet.
And we have our very unique language, our culture, our script, values, way of life, and historically we had our own independent states. We are uniquely different from the mainland Chinese.
Cumhurluklar bizde sanatkar millet dep ataydı.
The Chinese consider Uyghurs are very musical people.
Biz Tibetni 50-nji yılı besip aldı, bizde 1949-njy yılı Xitay komünistleri tarapından besip alıngan.
The People's Republic of China occupied Tibet in 1950, and a year earlier in 1949, China occupied our homeland.
Men aldığımki asırdaki tarihlarda özümüzdeki dünyanın devlet kurup ötken vaktimizi sözlep ötmeyle, muşu aldığımızdaki asırda biz iki kıtım Şarkı Türkistan müstakillik devletinince kaldı.
I don't want to go back too far to history, but during the 20th century, early 20th century, we twice declared independence.
İki kıtımda Stalin'inki yardımı bilen Xitay hükümetindeki besip verdi.
In both of those times, Stalin, basically, then Soviet leader, supported the Chinese communists to occupy our homeland.
Xitay hükümeti bizde besip vargandan keyin xuddi Şizan Abdunum Rayın degende Xinjiang Uyghur Abdunum Rayın dep Abdunum Rayın hukuku verdi.
After Chinese occupation of our homeland, China gave us the so-called Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, just like it gave the Tibetans the Tibet Autonomous Region.
Biz Xinjiang Uyghur Abdunum Rayın, Tibet Şizan Abdunum Rayın, Mongol Abdunum Rayın degen bu gaplardan bizge nahayat yaxshi siyasetlerini verdi. Biz sizlerni baxtli qilamiz, öz tilinglar bilan so'zlaysizlar, o'zinglar iqtisodinglar bilan taraqqiy qilasizlar. Biz faqat sizlarga ixtisos odamlarimiz kelib yordam qilamiz dedi. Bizni besib olgan vaqtida askar va uning ayollari 2% Xitoy bor edi.
And when we were given the so-called autonomy, the Chinese authorities promised to respect our language, our culture, our religious beliefs, our way of life, and they also said we would enjoy self-rule. The Chinese government will only send highly professional Chinese to our homeland to help us, whether that is with us or with the Tibetans or with the current Inner Mongolia, which is also an autonomous region. And at the time, the Chinese population in our home territory were only 2%.
Ana şu vaqtida bizga o'zinglarning Abdunum Rayini, o'zinglarning taqdirini o'zinglar belgilaysizlar, rahbaringlar o'zinglar bo'ldi, butun ish o'rni yer osti boylig'inglar, yer usti boylig'inglar o'zinglarning bo'ldi degan edi.
At the time, the Chinese promised that we would enjoy self-rule, and the leaders of the region will be our own people, and we will control the political powers and also the natural resources that is in our homeland.
Lekin unda bo'lmadi. Xinjiang Uyghur Abdunum Rayın degan narsani bo'ynimizga qiltaq qilib, Tibet xalqini bizni mush 60 yildan beri bastirish bilan shunda qattiq etnik qirg'inchilik qildi.
But in fact, the Chinese government used the autonomy framework as a noose, basically, to hook the Uyghurs, to destroy us as a people. Under 6 decades of Chinese communist rule, the Chinese government's only answer to all kinds of legitimate Uyghur demands, whether it is in East Turkestan or Tibet, is repression and nothing else.
Bizning tariximizda, bizning tatgan azap uqubatlarimizni o'qimoqchi bo'lsanglar Tibet bilan o'xshash.
If you want to, compare our suffering and situation, it's the exact same as the suffering of the Tibetans.
Uyghur degan bu ismni milliy bo'lgunchilar ataydi.
Today, if you are Uyghur, you are a suspect. You are normally considered as a separatist in China.
Hatta ko'chib kelgan ko'chmanlarga bizning yer, mulkimiz, munbat yerlarimiz, o'tirayotgan uylarimiz, mol mulklarimizni majbur tortib elib, bekorga ko'chman Xitoylar ulashtirib berdi.
And for the last 6 decades, the Chinese authorities basically confiscate the lands and properties of the Uyghurs and turn those over to the incoming Chinese settlers.
Onun qarşı chiqqanlarning hammasini milliy bo'lgunchilar turmaga tashlab, oldiga o'lim jazosi, keyingi muddatli qamoq jazosi hukm qildi.
And any Uyghur who resists such unjust policies is arrested, sentenced, and in many cases executed as separatists or counter-revolutionaries.
Uygurların avukat kılıç hukuku yok, edilip ketkenliği mi, ya ki kesilip ketkenliği mi?
And Uyghurs can never like hire attorneys like here to defend their charge, whether they are arrested, sentenced, or even executed.
Endi ben kıskartıp aytıma 60 yıldan beri biz 10 xil narsaga duch keldik.
And I would like to briefly tell about some 10 kinds of policies to destroy the Uyghur people in the past 60 years.
Xitay hükümeti nait qo'yga boshqa bizni nait ustunlik bilan etkin qirg'inchilik qildi. Birinchi iqtisodiy jihatdan vayron qildi.
And the Chinese government is very crafty in many ways in destroying people like us. One of which ways they use is to reduce us into absolute poverty.
İkinci ma'rif jihatdan namratlik qattiq bo'lib, xalqimizni ma'rifdan vayron qildi.
The second way is to destroy our educational systems so that leave our people in ignorance.
Üçüncü bizim dini itikadimizni vayron qildi.
The third is to attack our religious beliefs and practices so that people know nothing about what to believe.
Biz bilan birga cho'g'ib kelayotgan tarixiy madaniyatimizni yo'qotdi.
And attack upon our culture and identity was extremely aggressive.
Ondan keyin bizning adamlarimizni o'z tilimizda, o'z yezikimizda so'zlashni cho'q chekladi.
And also banned the use of our language and our script in all official levels and in instruction as well.
Ondan keyin ko'pish huquqimizni chekladi.
And also the Chinese government strictly controls the birth of the Uyghur people.
Ondan keyin Uyghur xalqining bir yerda tug'an Uyghur xalqining tarqaqlar siyosatida bizni sargardon qiladi.
And another policy is to basically to banish the Uyghur people, to spread them out. From north they banish them to the south, from south to the north, so that they don't feel like they belong somewhere.
Cümlede ben özel 10 yaş vaxtında tarqaqlaştırış siyaseti bilan oilam bilan sargardon bo'lib chiqib ketgan, maktab o'qish orzusi bilan yig'lab yurib, maktabga erishamedim. 13 yoshgacha boshlang'ich maktab o'qigandim.
For example, when I was 13, my entire family was banished from the north to the south by the Chinese authorities. And because of that banishment, although I always longed to go to college, but I didn't have that kind of luxury because of this banishment policy of the Chinese authorities.
Bizni maktabdan olib o'tgandan keyin, bizni sargardon qilib o'tgandan keyin, bizni nomrod qilib o'tgandan keyin, sirtdan kelganlar bizni nelar tunishtirdi? Bular o'qimagan, bular savotsiz, bular xalaq deb tunishtirdi.
Then when you go to China, the Chinese authorities usually, they introduce like the Uyghurs. They say they are very backward, they are very lazy, they are very stupid, and they know nothing.
Bütün hizmet, bütün okuş, bütün imtiyaz hepsi Xitay koşullarına verildi.
And all the power, all the privileges, all the employment, all the benefits belong to the incoming Chinese settlers.
Yani buna karşı çıkan, fikir kılan, ya ki teşvikler yazgan, ya ki bir şiir yazgan, ya ki kitap yazgan, ya ki köylerdeki hakiki sözünü edip koyan her kandak Uygur derhal turgulu tohtatına ekledip aşağıda ölüm cezası, kamak cezası bilen bir taraf koyuldu.
So for the past 6 decades, any Uyghur who writes anything, like a book or poetry or like a letter or anything, complain about China's this kind of policies, is arrested, imprisoned, and executed.
Cümleden bizde besvaran 60 yıldan beri biz tinchlik, erkinlik degandan so'z etish mumkin emas. Tinchlik degan shu narsani 60 yildan beri talmir izlab topamadik.
In short, in the last 6 decades, let's just forget about freedom. We didn't even enjoy one day of peace under Chinese rule.
Her qanday oiladan 2dan 3dan adam yoki turmushga kirgan yoki yetilgan. Hamma adam qachon turmushga kirganimizni deb qo'rqib, hatto bir-birisi bilan onasi bolasiga, bolasi onasiga ishonmay, pichirlab so'zlaydigan, yashaydigan holatga kelib qo'ydi.
In every Uyghur family, you'll find one or two individuals either arrested by the Chinese authorities, sentenced, or even executed. So the Uyghur people live in absolute fear, and nobody trusts nobody there. And even parents are very careful with their own children, and the relatives are wary of their own relatives.
Xitay hükümeti o arkadan en ahırda köşmenlerini destekte biraz çocuğun bizim halkımızdan. Kiyinki dınşopun çıkandan keyin Uygurların bir kısımları değişik buldu. Uygurlar bay buluşga ruxsat qilamiz, öz makonlariga qaytib kelishga ruxsat qilamiz. Uygurlarga bundan keyin baxt turmush beramiz deb dınşopun chiqib, islohot etish degandan keyin shunday va'da berdi.
But when Deng Xiaoping, the late Chinese leader, came out, he promised the so-called reform and opening up in China, try to help develop China economically. He at the time promised that some Uyghurs could make some money.
Bir kısım Uygurların günahsız tutulganda içi ağırdı. Biz sizlerle yaşlık kılımız bunundaki tinçlik asasında bir kısım siyasi mahpuslarına turnudur koyardı.
And he said our government treated the Uyghurs very bad in the past, but we'll change our policies.
Uyghur halkı endi biz baxt kelishliğe o'xshaymiz, tinch yashashga o'xshaymiz deb qo'shib ketdi.
And in those days, some of the Uyghurs were very happy. They thought that things would eventually change, and they would be able to live in peace.
Men shu siyosatda hapalang chiqib toza boy bo'lib oldim.
And at the moment, at that time, I thought that was good, and so I also took advantage of that time to be able to make some money.
Lekin uzun o'tmaylar qaytadan yangi siyosat chiqdi. Uyg'urlarning milliy bölgünchilar bilan diniy radikalist va g'arbparastlarni bir taraf qilamiz dedi.
But soon afterwards, the Chinese policy changed very bad towards the Uyghurs. Then the Chinese began to round up Uyghurs as separatists and extremists.
Şunun bilan bizni qaytadan turmuq tutib tashlashga boshladi.
And hundreds of thousands of Uyghurs were imprisoned as a result.
Bunun chidamagan ilik xalqi, G'o'ji xalqi, shunga chidamagan Sharqiy Turkistonning boshlari 15 ming odam ilida namoyishga chiqdi.
Then in February 1997, lots of young Uyghurs, some 15,000 Uyghurs in the city of G'o'ji, they took the streets to peacefully protest against China's heavy-handed policies.
Ular biz tinchlik bilan chiqdik deb hammasi qo'lini bo'ynini ustiga olib chiqdi.
They took the streets proving that they didn't have any kind of weapon. They all raising their hands, walking.
Xitoy hukumati bularni soqchilar bilan bir taraf qilmay, askarlarni urushga chiqadigan askarlarni yo'lkab akilib, mushundan qattiq sovuqda 2-oyning 5-kuni ishlatdi suvchicha, bir qismini maydonga yalang'ochlab turib, qatirib o'ldirdi, qog'ozlarni bostirib, tanklar bilan, miltiqlar bilan it qitolib, naq maydonda ashadil 207 odamni itib o'ldirdi.
Instead of listening to their legitimate demands, the Chinese authorities did not use police, but they deployed troops, basically shot and killed them, just opened fire toward them, killed some 407 of them. And it was February 5th, it's like colder than today, basically. And they used fire trucks, stripped all these young men and women naked in the gymnasium, and poured water on top of their head. And many of them, as a result, had to amputate their limbs.
Uyg'urlarni tutish, kam ko'lamda tutish 7-numberlik hujjatdan boshqa 9-numberlik hujjatdan yana bir hujjat chiqadi.
Then they issued directives one after another to round up all those who participated in the demonstration and their relatives.
Namoyishga qatnashganlar va ularning do'stlari, tuqqanlari, ularni hissashlik qilganlar deb 4 xil odamni tutish siyosati chiqadi.
And in those directives, they basically said the protesters, their relatives, their friends, and those sympathizers should be arrested. 2003-yili Shigar bo'lgan Xitoyning e'lon qilgan gazetida 61 ming odam qo'llanilgan. And there is a world journal here, it's in Chinese. They published that the statistics announced by the Chinese authorities. After the protest, basically the Chinese authorities arrest some 61,000 Uyghurs. 11 ming odam muddatsiz kesilgan. 11,000 was sentenced to life.
8 ming odamimiz, yoshlarimiz g'oyib bo'lib ketgan.
Some 8,000 disappeared.
Ularni qanday o'ldirganligini uqmaymiz. Ishqilib har 2 kunda bir qatim ko'chalarni aylantirib o'lim jazosi hukm qilgan odamlar mashinalarda 5 mashinada 6 mashinada erib minib, oshkora o'lim jazosi hukm qildi. Uning ota-onasi cho'qim chavoq chekib turish kerak. Butun Uyg'ur xalqini ikki tarafda turg'izib chavoq chaldirdi. And we're not aware of how many Uyghurs were killed by the Chinese authorities, who were tortured to death in prison. But right after the massacre, the Chinese authorities basically loaded the Uyghur prisoners who were to be executed, parading in the Uyghur towns and villages, forcing the relatives and parents to clap as their sons and daughters are being taken out for the execution. Çavaşkanlıqlarını, aşı ölüm cezasını açıqqanlarını görüp yığılğanlarını naq meydandan söylep olib chiqib iqtilalatdi.
And for those parents and relatives who did not clap or instead shouted or cried, the Chinese authorities used dogs to basically
Men şu vaqtda Xitoy hukumatining millionlarini ham Xitoy hukumati menga cho'ng bir amal bermoqchi.
At that time, of course, I was wealthy and I was also an official in China.
Men Xitoy uchun xizmat qilgan bo'lsam, men bu kabi o'ylarni undan nechasi o'sib ketadi.
If I kept silent at the time, I would have been probably wealthier or now.
Men shu chaqda bunga qarshi chiqdim. Demak, men shu ahvolni hammasini tekshirdim. Shu chaqda mana bizning Guantanamo'dagi bugun 17 bola, shu vaqtdagi yoshlar jinini elib, bizning Uyg'ur xalqi chegara Pokiston, Afg'oniston, Qozog'iston, Qirg'iziston, O'zbekiston bu qatorliq o'rinlar bizning chegaramiz. Tarixdan beri biz qaçsak, ana shu 60 yildan beri, 100 yillardan beri yenimizdagi qo'shinlarimizga qaçamiz.
Yeah, so after that massacre, basically, a lot of young Uyghurs had to flee out of the country from the Chinese persecution. And our neighboring countries, if you look at the map, it is Afghanistan, Pakistan, today it's Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, all these countries. So that's the first country, for the Uyghurs to flee. So some of the Uyghurs actually in Guantanamo are some of those Uyghurs who had to flee Chinese persecution into the neighboring countries. And sometimes some Uyghurs who were not politically active, they go to those countries and do some little business.
Şuna şu ocakta keçip çıkıp, cenini ep geçip, yer kapamay verip turup kalgan ballarımızı Pakistan $5,000'dan terörcüler hapsi ediverdi.
And some of the Uyghurs fled into these countries and they could not stay too long there. And to save their lives, some of them went to Afghanistan or Pakistan. And after 9/11, they were sold out by the Pakistanis to the American forces, $5,000 apiece.
Lekin bu setilliklarda bu ballar baxtlikken, yana bizim baxtimiz var ekan.
Actually, they were lucky they were sold to the Americans.
Çünkü biz ular gerçi erkeklikten mahrum kalan olsa mı, o Xitay'dan turmusu düşken olsa bu kelge Allah kaçanı itip, ularının ya urup öldürendi ya itip öldürendi, hiç kadar bir soraksız ölendi, ularının isi bu süre hiç kim okumaydı.
Because if they were sold to the Chinese authorities, they would have been executed a long time ago by the Chinese as hardcore terrorists. But at least at the moment, although they don't have their freedom in Guantanamo, but they are still alive.
Mesela bu yıl soygun başladı. 2008 yılı 1. ayın 18. günü 15 bin Uygur'un 5 yıl içinde kolga alanlarını ilan kıldı.
Because the situation in our homeland is so bad, the Chinese Chief Justice of our region, he stated that in the past 5 years they arrested 15,000 Uyghurs.
5 yılda. Muş Olimpik'ten aldı kendini yana bir muşlukta kolga alanlarını ilan kıldı.
And they just recently announced that just during the Olympic period, they arrested 1,300 Uyghurs.
Mınlıgan, 10 mınlıgan günahsız ballarımız turbu deyip adı lazım.
So today we have hundreds of thousands of innocent Uyghurs languishing in dark Chinese prisons.
Xitay hükümeti bizni terörist kılıp dünyaya köktüşken intayın arzu kıladı. Çünkü ular bizni terörist dep bastırmadı.
And China is doing everything in its power to portray us, our peaceful people, as terrorists, because then they can repress us with better justification.
Ular Olimpik'ten faydalanıp, isminden faydalanıp bizni bastırdı.
Last year, China used Olympic security as a justification to basically intensify the crackdown upon the Uyghur people.
Hazır hem de dünyanın iktisadi krizisidir. Muşunun faydalanıp bastırmadı bizni.
No, because of global economy and a lot of countries are dependent on China, so the China is using that as another excuse to justify the crackdown.
Ular bizni millet sütüde yaşardı. Kırıp tüyütüş için aşırı bir bağlılar demiş gerek.
So the Chinese government's intent is really, to destroy us as a people, and under all kinds of justifications, one after another.
Bizim terörist emesliğimizde Cumhur hükümeti dünyanın başka yerinde hemmenin ben yaşlı okudu.
In fact, the Chinese government knew that Uyghurs were not terrorists. They were already struggling for their freedom.
Mana şunun için bugün Guantanamo bağlarına bütün Amerika'daki insanperver, akıllı kişilik hukuk teşkilatları hepsi yardım kılıp, ulanı erkinlikle eriştiriş için güreşli vardı. Bizim özümüz şundan hem Amnesty International hem avukatlar, Amerika'daki adil adamlar bizim bağlarımızın günahsızlığını oturup koyup güreşlik vardı. Amerika hükümeti bizim bağlarımızda günahsızlar ilan kıldı.
And today, because of freedom-loving people like you, organizations like Witness Against torture and other human rights organizations, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the attorneys who are working tirelessly for the Uyghur detainees in Guantanamo because of their concerns and their struggle for justice. And at the end of the day, basically, although the Uyghurs are not released, at least, U.S. has declared that they are not enemy combatants. They were at the wrong place at the wrong time, and they deserve to be free.
Germania, İtalya, Fransa, Angliya, Finlandiya, Norvegiya, Gollandiya, Avustraliya, Kanada qatarlıq dövlətlər Uyğur balalarını günahsız olsun biz alımız deb Avropa parlamentçi basıya bildi. Xalqları qozgulup çıkıp aş Uyğur 17 balını alısan deb hökumetiga besim işletip atıdı, parlamentlar besim işletip atıdı. Lekin Xitoy hökumeti bütün dünyaga aş Uyğur 17 balını almaysın deb besim işletip alızmadı.
And many European countries, whether that's Germany, France, Italy, Norway, Sweden, or whether Canada, Australia, or all of these countries, they're all considering to take those Uyghurs if given. But of course, the Chinese authorities are basically threatening those countries not to take the Uyghurs and warning them that these Uyghurs are already terrorists.
Ular 17 balını qaytırıp elip, bütün halkımızdan aldığı açık edip, Uyghur halkının yürkünü yanı bir mucumak için.
We know the Chinese government intent is to bring the Uyghurs back to China, declare they're the hardcore terrorists, execute them, just demonstrating to the entire Uyghur people. That's what happens when the Uyghurs stand up against authoritarian Chinese rule.
Hem Uyghur halkı kalp dünyası en sana yardım kıldığını demek için.
Let's say the entire Western world is on our side. So if you're against us, you're already against the free world.
Bunu bugün tünürün ki bana telefon geldi. Hazır Pakistan'daki adamlar bizim Uygurlarını hazır Xitaylarını tutup soğudu kıkırı çıkan adam, küçük çıkanlarını tutup Xitaylarını özü $5,000'dan zevk tuttu.
And we just learned from some of the Uyghurs in Pakistan actually. And for some of the Uyghurs who come to Pakistan to do some little business, not involving any kind of political activities, even those Uyghurs were sold by the Pakistanis to the Chinese now for money. Just accusing them by getting involved in some kind of political activities.
Bizim kırımdaş milletlerimiz, kırımdaş devletlerimiz küçük çıkan Uygurların hemini kaydırıp ölüm cezası hüküm kılıyor, o dersiz müddet tutanmak cezası hüküm kılıyor.
And in the past, for Uyghur activists who fled into like Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Central Asian countries, all of those countries extradited the Uyghurs back to China, where most of them were executed by China.
Uların bizge işi ağlıdır. Lekin ular soğudu menfaat, Xitay'ın soğudu menfaatini oylayın.
And all they think about the good business deals with China and the concessions they can get out of China. So they just sell us out.
Bizge fakatmış, bizni kaydırıp vergenmiş, her dünyasını bizge yardım kıldı.
So the only countries that have now sent Uyghurs back to China are the Western countries in the free world.
Endi biz hazır, bizim Guantanamo'daki ballarımızda uşundan çıkırış üçün Amerika hükümetinin, Obama hükümetinden sorayımız. Prezident Bush hükümeti günahsız dep verdi, endi Obama hükümetininki muşu bolsa Amerika'ya koyup verişini unutarız. Eğer Amerika'ya koyup vermeyen takdirde başka dünyanın, garip dünyalarına bizim halkımızda, aşk o yetti balımızda koyup verişini unutarız.
So we've been working very hard to get the 17 Uyghurs released in the United States or in another Western country. And in the past, of course, we're working with the Bush administration, although his administration did not release them, but at least declared they were non-enemy combatants. Now, our hope is that the Obama administration will consider resettling them here, or at least in a third Western country.
Muşu garip dünyası qarğandikin hazır bütün Uyghur halkının Uyghur bo'lgan adamning chet elga chiqish huquqi mangu mahrum qilindi, bütün hammasini pasporti jilbilindi.
But of course, the situation of the Uyghurs at home is still very bad. For most of them, they can never travel outside because the Chinese authorities have universally confiscated the passports of all Uyghurs.
Şu biz Uyghur bo'lib qolganligimiz uchun, aşı münbet ziminning egisi bo'lib qolganligimiz uchun, şu ziminning egisi bo'lib qolgan gunohimiz uchun Guantanamo'da 17 balamiz gunohsiz ketyapti. Bütün dunyoda bu odamlarimiz sargardon bo'lib kechyapti.
So our only crime is that we are Uyghurs and we happen to own a piece of resource-rich land that China covets so well, and anything we say we do is considered terrorism by China, and we have to flee Chinese rule. Then, for better or worse, we ended up in a place like Guantanamo.
Dalai Lama efendim hayat geçip çıkalı dedi. Bizden liderimiz de ayrıklandı parlatıp öldürdü. Şunun için biz hazırlıkçı avazımızda anlatamadık. Yani yakından beri anlatıp kevatımız. Amerika'mı yardım kıvatıdık, Harp dünyasını yardım kıvatıdık. Yani ulanınkini bütün dünya anladı. Bana bizden takdirimiz muşundan ayaklaşıvatıdık, muşundan getivatıdık.
In the case of Tibetans, actually, they are very lucky because Dalai Lama, His Holiness, and his government officials were able to flee before the Chinese could kill them all. But in our cases, our president and ministers were killed in so-called plane crash before Chinese occupation. So since our homeland is landlocked, we could never leave the country to go to the Western country to let the world know what has happened to us. Whereas the Tibetans have been successfully able to let the world know their terrible suffering. So, but for the past couple of years, we have been able to raise our voice and to let the world know how the Chinese communists are destroying us as well as the Tibetans.
Ben o ballarının erkinliği için her minut takazzamen. Ula qandaq erkinlik her minut takazza bolsa men şuncha takazza. Çünkü ben 6 yıl turmada yetip baktım. Hem ballarım yetyaptı. Bizning ailemiz ve bütün xalq o ballarga takazza olib turyaptı. Biz hozir şu an bütün Uyg'ur xalqi özümüz Amerikaga qo'yib bersa, o yerda aile taki aşı ballar chiqib, o'zining jinini o'zi bekib, o kirib hayotini ko'chirguncha ustimizga oldik.
I'm just looking forward to the day of their freedom. I'm sure they're waiting for it every second of it, to be free to hear or elsewhere. So that's why the entire Uyghur community here, and the rest of the world are more than willing to help them, because I know the taste of freedom as I was in prison, and my 2 sons are in prison now, and many Uyghurs are still in prison. So we long for freedom, and we love freedom, and we know how much they want to be free. So here, we as a community, we're more than willing to help those 17 Uyghurs once they are released into the United States, to help them get settled, so that we will do our best to transition them into a constructive members of our society here.
Bizning Uyg'urlar o yerda aile her bir aile birden balını üstüge aldığım oldu. Ular hiç kançı çoğunluğa ay aileme emas, uşaq balları var. Lekin ular muşu sergendarçılık, muşu azap okubetle ortak baştan geçirgen bu başka. Her baş turmadan çıkan malların qanday xarakteri bo'lishdan qat'iy nazar biz ularni yetaklaymiz, hem ularga yordam qilamiz deb ustiga oldi. Men bu oldim. Biz Uyg'ur kommunitetiga shunday qilamiz. Hammalarning yordam qilganiga, fikrimni, gapimni anladığınızga rahmat.
Yes, so we have 17 families here who are ready to take the 17 Uyghurs. If they are released and be settled in the United States, we are ready to render all kinds of assistance. Although the Uyghur community are new here and not quite wealthy, many of these families, but because we share the common suffering and we know the price of freedom and we long for that, so we are hoping as a community to give them their freedom, long denied freedom, and that's why we're fighting for that very hard. So thank you very much for all of you for coming today to listen to our plight and our story. Thank you.
Hammalarga baxt tilayman.
I wish you all the best and may God bless you. Yes, if you have questions, please feel free to. Yes.
The first question is whether or not there is. It's actually 2 questions. Whether or not there is an armed resistance among the Uyghurs, and if so, does she have a critique of that armed resistance?
Менің суарға айтқан суалымызда Uyg'urlarning ishida hozir ham Xitoy qoralib qarshi turayotganlar bormi? Bo'lsa sizning bunga qarata tanqidingiz bor.
Endi bir millatni shu qadar ezish, shu qadar bostirish hozirgi mush asrda bizning xalqimizning beshiga kelgan bu dard hozir bugungi kunni tortayotgan men bugun bunday ko'p so'zlab berdim. Hech qanday bir millatning beshiga yo'q deb qo'yaman.
And in today's situation, if you really go and see the suffering of the Uyghur people, you would be shocked that in 21st century, actually, people in a country like China is suffering like that. And the Chinese policies basically radicalizing or pushing the Uyghurs to a point of no return. Basically, they were forced to resist at some point.
Shunda bo'lsa biz bizning xalqimizni Xitoy diktatorlari tarafidan har qanday asli biz tinchlik bilan butun dunyoga ovozimizni anglatish orqali biz cho'qim erkinlikka erishimiz degan bilan shunda faoliyat olib boryapmiz.
But we have been so peacefully struggling, in spite of all of the heavy-handed policies, the killings of the Uyghur people. We have been peacefully struggling for our freedom for a very long time.
Men bu xalqimni shunga yetaklab
And that is also my personal goal, to lead the Uyghurs to non-violently resist this violent rule.
Lekin vatan ichidagi Uyg'urlarni Xitoy hukumati ashuna majburlaydi.
But in China, actually, the Chinese government is pushing some people to resist with arms to justify the repression.
Mesela bu kadar bir bana bir şiir yazmak için bir şiir çıkarmak için 20 yıl kesildi.
And one example is one Uyghur just recently wrote like a poetry. He was sentenced to 20 years for writing a poetry.
Çıkarmak şiir için. Bir bana 40 gektarlık bir servis için o şiir kesildi.
And for another young man writer, he wrote like a short story called Blue Pigeon, and he was sentenced to 13 years.
Şu anda halkı şunçalık tındırak altını koymaları için birer grup adamın ulan aşında kurallı karşı çıkmaydı deyip ben denemedim.
So, because of this kind of really devastating situation, I can promise that some people may not take out some kind of use some violence, unfortunately.
Lekin biz özümüz 90% adam tinchlik bilan faoliyat olib boryapmiz. Ko'p % emas, hammamiz degandek tinchlik bilan faoliyat olib boryapmiz va tashviqotni shunday kuchlantiryapmiz.
But the majority of the Uyghur people, and they're always very peaceful, and all of our organization, they're always struggling peacefully. That's what we are fighting for. And I've been always exhorting the Uyghur people never use violence.
Xitoy hukumati bizning shu tinchlik bilan olib borgan faoliyatimiz uchun nihoyat xafa va ish pishyapti.
But the Chinese government has become very patient because of our peaceful struggle, because they like to see violence, then they will use massive violence against us, our people. Yes, anyone else? Any other questions? Yes, at the back, please.
Not a question, but it's sad to hear this story. It's very similar to what the United States government has done to the indigenous people here, to the Indian. You know, that any place where Indians have had resources, minerals, water, fish, whatever, the government has found some pretense to, make provocations and take their land and slaughter the people. So maybe the United States government will help Uyghur because that's far away. But all the big powers take land and resources from their indigenous people. This has happened all over the world. It's very sad. But maybe this government, which is very hypocritical, would somehow like to help the Uyghurs to make Chinese look bad. Maybe.
Sizlardan hikoyalarni aytib fojiali bir hikoyaga dedim. U xuddi Amerikadan burungi indianlarga qaratganligi siyosatga o'xshagan. Amerika hukumati o'sha indianlarning yeri bo'lsa, boylik bo'lsa, belgil bilan deb bo'lsa, ular bir bahona bilan ularni bostirib kirib, o'ldirib yerni egallab shunday qilgan deydi. Meni o'yladim bo'lsa, hozir ham Amerika hukumati, deputat Dumas bir hukumat bo'lsa, hamda Xitoy hukumatining sizlar qaratgan ziyonkashlik siyosatni yomon ko'z tushishi balkim bir yordam qilib qoladi. Savol emas.
Thank you.
And one question here, yes.
I apologize if this is too personal of a question, but I'm so intrigued by you spending 6 years in prison. I'm wondering, how did you survive, and how do you survive now knowing that your children are there in prison?
Benim sualım var, eğer geçirsiniz bu meselelerle şahsi bir sual buluş mümkün değil. Siz o'zingiz 6 yilda turmush etibsiz, o'rmondan qanday o'zingizni hayot ochiqdingiz, yana birisi hozir ishga o'rningiz turmaydi. Buni qanday siz o'zingizni shunday yana irodalik yashaysiz?
Ben 2 yıl fakat aptap ko'may qarang'i turmada yotqizdi. 45 kunda bir qatim 10 minut aptap ko'katdi.
The first 2 years of my confinement was solitary confinement. I was able to get some sun, something like that, like 10 minutes in every 45 days.
Bedellerim şişip ketdi. Men şu ölüp qalmay dep, şu qo'limni, putimni, tilimni davomli mindirtib turdim.
And my whole body swelled up, and in order to survive, to live, I was just moving my body, doing a little bit exercise.
Men onun içindeki meynetçilikni sizlarga tasavvur qilib beraman.
I could not possibly use human language to describe how disgusting and dirty that cell was.
Onundikin dünya xalqaro tashkilotlari mening ishimga aralashgandan keyin meni yo'riq o'yga 4 yil ochdi. So'zlash, yezish, odamlarga qarash huquqim cheklandi.
Then after the international involvement of my case, the Chinese authorities put me in a different cell with other inmates, basically. But I was forbidden to write, read, speak, even look at other inmates.
Ularning menga eng ochiq qiladigan yeri davomli yosh Uyg'ur bolalarni akilib mening oldimda qiynaydi.
And the worst thing I have seen in the prison was that the Chinese prison guards bring in young Uyghurs and torture them in front.
Sen Uyg'urlarni qutqizdigan odam bularni qutqizmamsa deydi.
They say, aren't you supposed to save your people? Why don't you come and save this young man?
Mana aşı narsa meni g'ayratga keltirdi. Men cho'qim chiqib qutuldira oladigan o'xshayman. Men qutuldirishim kerak deb men o'zimni qashdaq tutdim.
That is what strengthened me actually to save my people, do my best.
Lekin Xudo degan cho'qim shu bir narsani ko'rdi ekan.
But God is great.
Xitoy tarixida Uyg'ur siyosiy mahbusni hayot chiqargan emas.
In Chinese history, past 6 decades, not a single Uyghur was released early and alive in China.
Mana meni hayot Amerika qo'yib berdi. Demak, mening xalqimni men bilan Xudoyim qutuldirgan o'xshaydi.
And I'm the only prisoner China released early and into the United States. So I believe God has a plan. Something is going to change.
Şuna Xitoy hukumatı mening ovozimni to'xtatish uchun ikki balam turmaga olib ketdi. Biri 32 yosh, birisi 30 yosh.
Yeah, that's why in order to silence my voice, China imprisoned my 2 sons. One is 30 years old, one is 32.
Ular meni to'xtatamiz dedi, mening balalarım mening to'xtatishimni xohlamaydi.
And China wants me to stop from what I'm doing, but even my children in prison, they don't want me to stop.
Bu mening kuchim emas, dunyodagi erkinlik uchun ko'ngil bo'lgan sizlardek odamlarning kuchi bilan men bu yerga keldim.
Yes, I'm here alive today because of freedom-loving people like you, because of what you have done for people like me.
Guantanamodagi bolalar mana shu sizlarning kuchinglar bilan maydonga chiqib o'tdi.
And hopefully the boys at Guantanamo will become free like me because of what you do.
Men ishimni mening xalqimni cho'qim shunday qildi.
I believe my people will become free one day. Yes.
Given the latest statement from Attorney General Holder that Guantanamo is abiding by the Geneva Convention, what is your view of this? And obviously, I can't say for you, but it doesn't seem that this is the real situation. So, how do you think that we can help you in this situation?
Normal bir türlü oldu. Bunda devam dedi. Bunda şaraytımda oluşumuna dayanmamıştı. Lekin bu işler bir xil vaziyatda bizlar sizlarga yoki u Uyg'urlar qanday yordam qila olamiz?
Hamda sizlarning bizga qilgan yordamimiz bizning vatanimizdagi xalqning hozirgi shu bir narsani desam, qizlar masalasini deyman, Guantanamo bolalarni qildayman. Endi Guantanamoga sizlar shuni imzo etib shu qo'yib Amerikaga qo'yib berish, u bolalar xatarlik emas. Men ishinaman o'zimning xalqimning xarakterini qo'yib berish to'g'riliq imzo to'plab Prezident Obama apandimiga kirgizishinglarni umid qilaman deyapti.
Yeah, I think one of the ways in which you can help is probably collect signatures to get them released in the United States.
Could you speak up, please?
Oh, okay. Sorry. One of the ways in which you can help the Uyghurs is, besides your campaign, is to collect signatures from Americans to have them released into the United States to the Obama administration.
Andaki muş bütün mektepteki okuyucular ve okutuvchilar xalqqa imzo to'plab Uyg'ur xalqining milliy kimligini qutuldirib qilish to'g'riliq qonun ma'qullab berishga yo'llashingizni umid qilaman.
And also together, probably could be on the same sheet of paper, basically urge the U.S. Congress to pass a law, basically enact a legislation to protect the Uyghur people's language and culture as an indigenous people. And in our homeland, the situation is so bad that just for any Uyghur, like we explained a couple of other people, any Uyghur who says anything about Chinese policy, every Uyghur is pretty much a suspect in China. You're a suspect of, they call three evils. Three evils of they call separatism, extremism, and terrorism. When they say that, that means Uyghurs. In the rest of China, when the Chinese see a Uyghur, they feel like they're seeing a terrorist, basically. So in eastern part of China, you wouldn't see Uyghurs. Even if you see Uyghurs, they always live in fear. And in many cases, they're beaten to death in China. And their situation is so tragic. So the only people who can help them are outside, like either us in exile, or people like you in the free world who love freedom and justice so much, because they cannot raise their voice there whatsoever. Yes, please.
What's the size of the Uyghur community in the Washington, D.C. area and other places in the United States?
Washington'daki Amerika Uyg'urlarning nüfusu taxminan qancha?
Taxminan 1000 dan ortiq.
In the U.S. we have like a little bit over 1,000.
Washington area 300.
In the Washington D.C. area is the largest, some 300-ish. We're one of the smallest immigrant communities. That's how you see how China was able to basically control the land. And we couldn't just come here like every Chinese. Yeah. Yes, please. Yes.
What we've heard is that one of the ways that the guards at Guantanamo torture the prisoners is by abusing their religion, by debasing the Quran. Can you talk a little bit about that and about whether or not that's one of the big, if that's an issue with China, in China?
bizdan anlaşılmışça Guantanamo ki harbiylarni hamda turli yapayotganlarni Pakistonning jazolaydigan bir usul yapti. Qur'onni pasiyalar o'qib bir qil kerak. Ham Xitoydimi Uyg'urlarni diniy jihatdan jazolasa Qur'onlarni qanday qildi?
Xudo deb og'zidan gat deb chiqib ketgan bir Uyg'ur yoki Uyg'urdan birasining og'zidan chiqib ketsa yoki bir oyat o'qigan gap chiqib ketsa Xudo bor deganlarning put qo'lini urib chiqib ketdi. Askari ya shunda o'lib tugaydi, ya bo'lmasa shunda qiynalib birdan bo'ladi.
In China is for Uyghur, religious prisoners, if they pray or confess, they believe in God or do anything religious, the Chinese guards basically say, okay, let your God save you, then just torture them, just break their limbs, say, let's see if your God can help.
Qur'on deganni ko'rish mumkin emas.
In prisons, you wouldn't see anything, Quran or religious texts in Chinese prisons.
Bu Xitoydagi qiynashni men sana deb desam odamlar ishonmaydigan gaplar bor deydi.
Yeah, the Chinese government, the way it tortures the Uyghurs is, it's something you have never, not just imagined in your life. It's not any different than a Nazi did to the Holocaust.
2006 yildan tortib men bu odam ishonmaydigan gaplar hozir qiynashdimi ig'ir gap. Masalan, bir millatning biz tarixdan beri har qanday qiyinchilikka duch kelsakmi, lekin mushu qitim fojiaga duch kelmagan. Bir turmuning ichidagi gapni davat turmuning teshida bir millatning qizini har bir oiladan qizingni Xitoy o'lkasiga akitimiz deb yiliga 240 mingdan Uyg'urning 14 yoshdan 25 yoshgacha to'y qilgan qizni majburiy akityotdi. Mushunga qarshi chiqqanlarmi milliy bo'lgunchi terrorist deb turmoqqa tushyotdi. Ularni mashina qiynab urib o'ldirdi, g'oyib bo'lib ketdi turmoqlar.
Well, that's like we're talking about prison. At least that's where the Chinese government can legally or illegally torture, do whatever they want to do. That's just a talk about outside, in this so-called for the Uyghurs. In 2006, the Chinese government initiated another policy to forcibly transfer young Uyghur, unmarried Uyghur women from our rural areas, forcing parents to give up their teenage daughters to be forcibly recruited and transferred to eastern part of China to work as like slave laborers, basically. And for any parent who has a daughter, any age from 14 to 25-year-old unmarried daughter, who is not going to give up their daughter, is considered as a separatist, if resist, terrorist, or extremist, arrest, imprison, and execute. So we cannot even defend our own sons and daughters today, even if we're not in prison. As for people, they can do absolutely nothing against Chinese policy. Absolutely nothing. That's how bad the situation is. And after 9/11, 9/11 gave China the best opportunity to justify the practice of the Uyghurs. Because Tibetans are Buddhists, it's very popular in the West. If you're a Buddhist, you are considered peaceful or a pacifist. But after 9/11, somebody's a Muslim that has a problem with the government, that in many people's mind that automatically means terrorist. And China used that. China, as you know, it's an authoritarian state. It's not a democracy. There is no freedom of any kind, pretty much. And used to its full advantage to justify the otherwise unjustifiable repression of the Uyghur people, using that as claiming every Uyghur who is not happy with Chinese rule as a terrorist. So in China, political executions only take place against Uyghurs in historic Islam. China randomly, rarely executes Tibetans, never executes Chinese. In China, political executions all Uyghurs. Almost exclusively executes Uyghurs. So we are now we have few friends in the world, especially, and so China uses that to its advantage as well. Because when people do not raise our situation, China can do whatever it does as a free. Yes.
Part two of my
Sure.
question. How would you respond to the United States claim that the Uyghurs are in Guantanamo because they cannot send them back to China for fear that they will be executed? That's the first part of my question. The second part of my question would be, how would you respond to the fear that their incarceration in Guantanamo would transform a once peaceful person into a violent person? So, can you respond to that?
Мен so'raydigan savolimizda birinchisida Amerika hukumati bu Guantanamodagi Uyg'urlarni Xitoyga qaytarmaslik sabab deydi. Bu Xitoyga qaytarsa Xitoylarni idilishi mumkin deydi. Shu to'g'rimi deydi?
To'g'ri. Amerikaga bu to'g'ri biz rahmat aytamiz deydi.
Yes, your first question is about saying if U.S. returns the Uyghurs to China, they would be executed. That is true. China would do exactly that, and so we are very grateful for the U.S. government's decision not to return them to China because of that. And your second part of your question is, I'm sorry, I just forgot.
The second part would be, how would you answer the fear of many of the American people that a once peaceful person would turn into a terrorist because of his experience?
In Guantanamo.
In Guantanamo, yes.
Yani bir sualimiz var edemde Amerikalılarning kalsa belki ma'lum bo'lishi mumkin edemde asli masalan Uyg'urlar Guantanamoga kelgan chaqirlarni aytib tinchlikparvar bir ish qaralashmagan bir odamlar bo'lishi mumkin edi, lekin bu 7-8 yildan yo'q ular so'lab qo'yib qiynab buni qilganki bular endi g'azabdan payt kelib andan keyin kalista yo bir qilay yo terrorlik qilay yo zo'ravonlik qilay deb o'ylab qolish mumkinmi dedi.
Chunki ularning qinida bu narsa yo'q deydi. Xarakterda bu narsa yo'q deydi.
Yeah, it's not part of Uyghur national characteristics.
Narsa yo'q. Ikkinchisi, bular o'zining Xitoydagi qarindoshlarining qanday qiynoqlar bilan qanday o'ldirilganligini biz uqdik.
And they are all aware how they would suffer if they were in the hands of the Chinese authorities, how they'd be tortured or even killed a long time ago.
Hatta bularni Guantanamo turmusiga setib atganda naga operatsiya desa Amerikaning turmusiga operatsiya qo'shib ketibdi bular.
Actually, they were very happy when the Pakistanis sold them to the Americans because they thought, wow, we'd be free.
Biz qutuldiga o'xshaymiz deb. Lekin endi afsus, nayt qattiq qiynaldi, ular shularni o'ylaydi, bular biroz ümidsizlik bo'ladi. Biz ularga hamini tushundiramiz deydi.
Yes, it is a fact that, of course, after 7 years of unjust incarceration, of course, they're going to be angry about this, they're impatient. But our hope is once they're released, we're going to tell them, we're going to educate them, we're going to help them rebuild their lives and become basically constructive members, let them appreciate freedom and everything. So we don't think that would happen to, at least to our people.
Çünki Albaniyaga chiqqan 5 balani Albaniyaga berdi. Biz ularga shunday chiroyli tushundirdik, telefonlarda men texnik bormadim, endi bugun bir necha kundan keyin bormoqchi ular bilan ko'rishgan. Ular bizning deganimiz bo'yicha nayt yaxshi shunda qiynaldi uyaga borgandan keyin shunda bo'lsa nayt yaxshi gapimizni angladi va nayt maslashdi jamiyatga. Bizning shu Uyg'ur community ashuni maslashtirib ketdi.
For example, like the 5 Uyghurs released into Albania, none of them turned to be violent or anything like that. And actually, it was extremely hard for them to live and start a new life in Albania because there was no Uyghur community or nobody to support them. They also suffered in Albania tremendously. But still, because we communicated with them, talked to them all the time, explained to them, they should cherish their freedom, newfound freedom. All life is not easy. But now, after a couple of years now, they were able to adapt pretty well, get on with their lives, and just become normal, just constructive members of Albanian society now. So our hope is when there's Uyghurs released, we can do the same. Yes, any more questions? Yes, please.
Yes, in China,
Yes.
for the Uyghurs, what is the healthcare system like? Is it state of healthcare for them?
Yeah. Xitoydagi hamda Uyg'urlarning saqliqni saqlash, u yakfalda dora, doktorxona.
Deb tugatkili bo'lmaydigan darajada bizning odamlarimiz davolanish 5% yoki 10% odamlarning xizmat qilmoqchi ko'rinishga undaq qilib qo'ygan bilan qolgan odamlarning ahvoli intayin og'ir. Hatto AIDS kasalining tarqalishini butun ishkir o'lkadagi AIDS kasal bilan og'riyotganlarning hammasi Sharq Turkistonga bog'lab doktorxona ochmay AIDS mikrobi bilan o'layotganlarning oz emas.
Yeah, it is indescribable. It's disgusting. The healthcare. It's pretty much, it's not non-existent, it exists everywhere. But for the Uyghurs, it's just a racial discrimination, that's it. And for the Uyghurs, we have like 5, probably 10% of Uyghurs who sort of enjoy the so-called benefits of the Chinese rule there for a showcase, for China to showcase that how they were helping the Uyghurs. But for the majority, 90 or even more percent of the Uyghurs, they live in abject poverty, they cannot afford anything. In China, you have to pay to stay in the hospital, even though you are dying. So many Uyghurs die in front of hospitals. And AIDS is number 1. AIDS among the Uyghurs is number 1, drugs and AIDS. Even though we are one of the smallest communities in China. And because so many brothels, so many things open, even in village level. Like the Chinese prostitutes, they come to Uyghur villages, they call it hairdressers and salons, but they're really brothels. So AIDS, everything spread among the people. We are not sure that's a strategy of the Chinese government or that's just the way it is, but it's shocking to see how like Uyghurs as Muslim people, number 1 in AIDS and drugs. Yeah, China doesn't care. Their intent is they'd be happy if we all die out. Then the land, the resource, everything belongs to them.
Çünki ishkir o'lkadagi jinoyatchilarni turmadan chiqqan, zaharli chekimlik sotadigan jinoyatchilarni ham ashuni AIDS bilan og'irganlarning hammasini Sharq Turkistonga tashlaydi.
Yeah, the Chinese government has a long-standing policy to basically banish their hardcore prisoners, whether they're murderers, serial killers, drug addicts. There is one of the largest prisons, in our area. They ship their worst criminals to there. Once they're released locally, those prisoners. Yes. One last question.
Yes. One is you spoke of extraordinary long prison sentences that people were receiving that no Uyghurs ever gotten out early. Is how common or uncommon is it that someone will be sentenced to 9 years
Bu hem neyle kavayden de kettiğiniz Uygurlar'da küçükünü bir kısmı 10 yıl, 20 yıl sonra bitkiler. Lakin benim sualım ise aşık 10 yılda soruyorsun çıkamdı ya yeni devamlaştıran da.
Çıkıdığanları var çıkıp boğandaki uzun kamaylarına kirketidir. Çıkadık da bir şekilde çıkıp uzun kamaylarına kirketidir.
If like sentenced to 13 or 15 years, if they serve their term, they are released, and soon after something happens, some kind of situation changes, they lock them up again for many years. And the türmede yine katıydı bu.
Andikin turmunun içinde şu 10 yıl 15 yıl vakti toşka vakti sen gap anlamından şunun için yani 20 yıl uzattık da uzattık.
And for Uyghur political and religious prisoners, and in prison, if they are almost completing their term, then the government say not happy with them. Just say you disobey prison rules, they add up years. It will continue.
Meni 8 yıl kesken, lekin bu da bana özü şunda diye sen ölüp boğan ölügün mü çıkıp ketmeydi bir yerden. Biz asisini aşağı uzattığımız diye.
And when I was in prison, I was sentenced to 8 years in prison. I served 6. But the thing is, the Chinese prison official told me, you're going to die here, we're going to bury you here, and don't ever imagine you're going to leave here alive. That's, yes, you have one last one. Okay, thank you.
Is about how large the Uyghur population is in Munich. And the Munich city government had just sort of has some sort of legislation to allow for the transfer of the Uyghurs to Munich. But of course the state is not allowing that to go forward.
Şu an Münih şehirde hem de Münih'ten alakalı şehirle Uygurların kabul kılması değil de. Lakin hem de Münih'te hem de Uygurların nüfusu kaçlık değil.
Münih bir 200'de kadar. Bizden andikin Dünya Uygur Kurultayı'nın baş merkez bürosu aşağıda.
Yes, in Munich we have some 400 Uyghurs in total, and we have the World Uyghur Congress, the representative organization of all Uyghurs, is based in Munich. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.